If you worked in this country before 1988, you handled a $2 note. Green, worn soft, and there was a man on the front of it with a merino ram beside him. He is on that note because he is called the father of the Australian wool industry. He did not found it. He did not bring the first merino sheep to Australia. 2 naval officers did that in 1797, and he bought some off them. The person who kept the flock alive was his wife. Through 12 years he spent overseas. 4 of them after he shot his commanding officer in a duel. 8 after he helped overthrow a governor. And the family name he built it all under died out in 1882. 4 sons and not one surviving male heir between them. It only survives today because a granddaughter was granted royal permission to keep using it. Before we go any further, if you want to keep these stories alive, I've created a book with the complete Australian lost factories, the workers, the gates, the Australian maid, all gone. The link is on the first line of the description. Back to the story. A note before we begin. This story contains the names of Aboriginal people who have died and an account of a massacre. It is told with respect for the Dharawal people, on whose country this empire was built. Chapter 1. The Cow Pastures. Southwest of Sydney, between the Nepean River and the Razorback Range, there is a stretch of open grassland that the British would eventually decide was the finest grazing country in the colony. It is Dharawal country. The clan who lived on that particular ground were the Murringong. They had been burning it, hunting it, managing it and naming it for a very long time before anybody arrived with a surveyor's chain and started writing things down. Here is how it got its English name. In 1788, in the first months of the settlement at Sydney Cove, a small number of cattle wandered off and were given up for lost. 7 years later, in 1795, they were found again, about 60 kilometres southwest, standing in country nobody in the colony had bothered to look at properly. They were not just alive, they were fat. There were dozens of them. So the British named the place after them, the Cow Pastures. That name sets the terms for everything that follows in this story, and it is worth noticing. This is some of the best land in New South Wales, and the name it entered the written record under is a name that describes somebody else's escaped livestock. Not the people who lived there, not what they called it, the cows. That is more or less how the next 30 years went. The land was surveyed, valued, granted and fenced. The people who had been living on it were not consulted and barely appear in the paperwork at all. When they do appear, it is usually as a problem. By 1795, that wild herd was reckoned at around 60 animals, and within a few years at several hundred. In a colony that had spent 7 years on the edge of starvation, a self-sustaining herd of cattle nobody had to feed was close to miraculous. The cow pastures were declared off-limits to settlers at first to protect the wild herd. That did not last. Governors began granting the country out, and the largest single grant made there went to a man who had never seen it when it was signed, on the strength of a pamphlet he wrote in London. There is one more thing about that country worth holding on to, because it explains why everybody wanted it. The cow pastures are alluvial river flats backed by hills, well watered by the Nepean, open enough to run stock on without clearing, and carrying grass that had been managed by fire stick for millennia into exactly the condition a grazier dreams about. The British did not find wilderness there. They found a garden somebody else had made and assumed it had made itself. But in 1790, 15 years before any of that, a ship came into Port Jackson carrying a 23-year-old woman from Devon. She would end up running 5,000 acres of it. Chapter 2. The Death Fleet. Elizabeth Veal was born in Devon on the 14th of August 1766, the daughter of a farming family, and raised for part of her childhood in a clergyman's household, where she got an education that most women of her class and time did not. In October 1788, she married a young officer named John Macarthur. In 1790 they sailed for New South Wales with the Second Fleet, and it is worth being precise about what that means, because it is the worst thing that ever left England for this country. The First Fleet had been run by the Navy. The Second was contracted out to a private firm, which was paid per convict. Embarked rather than per convict landed. That arrangement produced exactly the result you would expect. 278 people died on the voyage. The Macarthurs started that voyage on the Neptune, which was the worst of the ships. Elizabeth wrote home about its master from the Cape of Good Hope, and this is her own phrase, in her own letter. "He proved himself," she wrote, "a perfect sea monster." Her husband quarrelled with the officers, as her husband quarrelled with everybody, and the family transferred to the Scarborough before the ship left Africa. They reached Port Jackson on the 28th of June, 1790, with their infant son Edward. Elizabeth Macarthur was the first officer's wife to arrive in the colony of New South Wales. She was 23 years old, she had a baby with her, and she had just crossed the world on the deadliest voyage in the history of transportation. What is remarkable about her, and the reason this film is built around her rather than around him, is what she was actually like. She was observant, she was funny in a very dry way, and she was a serious amateur botanist. She studied under Lieutenant William Dawes, the astronomer, and wrote home that no country could exhibit a more copious field for botanical knowledge than this one. She was also nobody's fool about the place. Writing to a friend in England in 1791, she said this: "Beauty, I have heard from some of my unlettered countrymen, is but skin deep. I am sure the remark holds good in New South Wales, where all the beauty is literally on the surface." In 1793 they were granted 100 acres at Parramatta. He named it Elizabeth Farm, after her. The house still stands at Rosehill. It is the oldest surviving European dwelling in Australia, and you can walk through it on a Tuesday afternoon. It is worth understanding what she had actually walked into, because it was not a farm and it was not a town. In 1790, the colony was 2 years old and starving. The stores were nearly out. The Second Fleet had arrived carrying not relief, but hundreds of sick and dying people who immediately needed feeding. Elizabeth Macarthur landed into a settlement that was, at that precise moment, closer to failing than it would ever be again. 4 years later, 2 naval officers came back from the Cape of Good Hope with some sheep, and the entire question of this film is who gets the credit for what happened next. Chapter 3. 6 sheep, maybe 8. In 1797, Captain Henry Waterhouse and Lieutenant William Kent sailed into Port Jackson from the Cape of Good Hope with a flock of merino sheep. They had bought them in South Africa from the widow of a Dutch colonel named Gordon, who was settling her late husband's estate. The animals were Spanish royal stock that had reached the Cape by a roundabout route through the Dutch royal family, which is how the tightest-held bloodline in Europe ended up on a farm in South Africa. About 26 sheep were loaded onto the ships. More than half of them died on the voyage. Now, say the next sentence slowly, because the rest of this story depends on it. John Macarthur did not bring the merino to Australia. Waterhouse and Kent did. Macarthur bought some of the survivors. So did several other men in the colony, including a clergyman we will come back to at length, and a handful of others. He was one buyer among several of a flock somebody else had gone and got. How many he actually bought is genuinely unsettled, and this film is not going to pretend otherwise. The State Library of New South Wales says 3 rams and 5 ewes. Camden Park's own published account and Sydney Living Museums say 6 animals, 2 rams and 4 ewes. The popular version says 8, which appears to conflate his purchase with the total number that made it off the ships alive. Those figures do not reconcile. You will have to hold all 3. There is one more thing to correct while we are here, because you will hear it in every retelling. The sheep are always described as smuggled. They were not smuggled. It was a purchase from a widow winding up her late husband's estate at roughly £4 a head, conducted openly and recorded. There is nothing furtive about it. The word got attached later because a founding story with a bit of theft in it is more fun than a founding story with a receipt. And there is one more correction, because the merinos were not the first sheep here either. The colony already had sheep, hairy Cape, and Bengal animals brought in for meat, carrying wool that no mill in England would look at. What the merino changed was not whether Australia had sheep, it was whether Australian wool was worth putting on a ship. What is true is that the flock grew, and grew fast. By 1795, Elizabeth was writing home that they had a dozen horses, 50 head of cattle, and about 1,000 sheep, and that her husband had set the first plough working in the country. The flock was real. The origin story has been decorated. And here is the part that actually mattered, and that has nothing to do with heroics. A merino fleece is only worth what a mill will pay for it, and what a mill pays for depends on fineness and consistency. Getting there is not a stroke of genius. It is 15 or 20 years of deciding which ram goes over which ewes, keeping the record straight and culling without sentiment. It is slow, unglamorous, technical work, done in a paddock, season after season. And in 1801, John Macarthur shot his commanding officer. Chapter 4. The Duel. On the 14th of September 1801, John Macarthur fought a duel with Lieutenant Colonel William Patterson, who was the commanding officer of his own regiment, and shot him in the shoulder. He was arrested. He was sent to England to face a court-martial, and he took 2 of the children with him to be educated there while he was at it. He was gone for 4 years, and he was supposed to be in disgrace. And here is where you have to be fair to him, because this is the part of his career where he genuinely earned something. He was supposed to be in England answering for shooting a superior officer. Instead, he made himself useful. He published a statement on the potential of colonial fine wool in 1803, and he wrote it for an audience of manufacturers and ministers rather than farmers. He put samples in front of English manufacturers. He appeared before the Privy Council, and his timing was extraordinary, because the Napoleonic Wars had just cut Britain off from Spanish and Saxon wool, and the mills of Yorkshire were staring at the prospect of running out of the raw material their entire industry depended on. So a man who had arrived as a lieutenant in a penal colony walked into the Privy Council of the British Empire and told them there was an answer on the other side of the world. It worked. In 1804, Lord Camden directed that he be granted 5,000 acres, with another 5,000 promised if he made a success of it. He chose the Cow Pastures. He named the property Camden, after the man who had signed the paper. Meanwhile, 12,000 miles away, somebody had to actually run it. Elizabeth managed the farm, the flock, the convict labour, the accounts, and the correspondence. And in 1805, a woman arrived who has been almost entirely written out of this story. Penelope Lucas came out as a governess. What the historian Alan Atkinson has established in a book published this year is that she was something considerably more useful than that. She was a bookkeeper working in double entry, and her accounting made a real difference to whether the Macarthur enterprise held together. She stayed with the family for more than 30 years. In 1807, the first bale of Australian wool was sold at Garraway's Coffee House in London for 10 shillings and 4p a pound. To put that in context, it was a price that made growing fine wool in New South Wales, 12,000 miles from the mill, a genuinely commercial proposition for the first time. Consider the position he had engineered by 1805. He had a 5,000-acre grant on the best grazing country in the colony, signed by a Secretary of State. He had the ear of British manufacturers. He had resigned his commission so the army could no longer discipline him. And he had a wife at home running the operation while he did it. And on the 26th of January, 1808, John Macarthur helped overthrow the government of New South Wales. Chapter 5. The Only Coup. The trigger was a ship. Governor William Bligh, who had already had one mutiny in his career on the Bounty, impounded Macarthur's schooner, the Parramatta, over a bond dispute, and then had Macarthur arrested. You need to understand what the New South Wales Corps was by 1808 to see why this worked. It was the only armed force in the colony. It controlled the rum trade, which functioned as the currency. Its officers held the land, the labour and the credit. It had already forced out one governor. Macarthur had been its paymaster. The trial began on the 25th of January, 1808. The bench was made up of 6 officers of the New South Wales Corps, and they sided with Macarthur against the judge advocate. The colony now had a criminal trial in which the court had effectively declared itself against the governor. The next day was the 26th of January, 1808. 20 years to the day since the colony had been founded, Major George Johnston marched roughly 400 soldiers of the New South Wales Corps on Government House, with the band playing, and deposed the Governor of New South Wales. It is the only successful armed overthrow of a government in Australian history. There has been exactly one, and this is it, and John Macarthur was at the centre of it. Bligh was held under house arrest for over a year in his own government house, while the men who had removed him ran the colony. Macarthur appointed himself colonial secretary to the new arrangement. Now the picture. You have seen it. Bligh being dragged out from underneath a bed by soldiers, in his uniform, looking ridiculous. That is, propaganda. It was a cartoon, drawn and circulated within hours of the arrest by the people who had just carried out the coup and needed the man they had deposed to look like a coward. The State Library of New South Wales and modern historians agree the far more likely explanation is that Bligh was doing what a governor under arrest would do, which is trying to secure his papers. It has been reprinted for 200 years because it is funny and because it was useful. It is probably the single most successful piece of political spin in Australian history, and it worked on everybody for 2 centuries. What happened afterwards is almost as telling. Governor Macquarie arrived in 1810 to restore order. Major Johnston was court-martialled and cashiered. John Macarthur was never convicted of anything. He simply stayed in England, out of reach of the courts, and waited. There is a detail in the aftermath that tells you how the colonial system really worked. Johnston, a serving officer, was court-martialled in London and cashiered. He had followed the instructions of a civilian. The civilian, who had no rank to strip and no commission to lose, walked away. He waited 8 years, and in those 8 years the sheep empire was actually built by somebody else entirely. Chapter 6. 8 years. John Macarthur left New South Wales in 1809 and did not come back until 1817. Add that to the 4 years he spent away after the duel, and you get roughly 12 years of absence during the exact period in which the foundation of the Australian wool industry was laid. Now, a correction, because this is the detail that most tellings get wrong. The sons were not holding the fort. James and William were in England with their father. John Jr. was in London training as a barrister. Edward was away for long stretches as well. The men of the family were, by and large, somewhere else. So, who ran it? Elizabeth ran it with her husband's nephew Hannibal Hawkins Macarthur, who arrived in 1805 and with Penelope Lucas on the books. Understand the size of that job. She was managing Elizabeth Farm at Parramatta, the run at 7 Hills, and the new country at Camden. That meant the breeding program and the decisions about which rams went over, which ewes, which is the entire technical basis of a wool flock. It meant lambing. It meant shearing and sorting and classing the wool. It meant supervising assigned convict labour. It meant supplies, in a colony that periodically ran out of food. It meant hiring, feeding and controlling men who had been sent here in chains. It meant the money, and it meant corresponding with a man on the other side of the planet. His letters took the better part of a year to arrive. Her replies took the better part of a year to reach him, which is to say she made every decision herself, alone, and explained it to him a year afterwards. The historian Alan Atkinson's summary of that correspondence is the funniest line in the entire literature on this family. John, he writes, sent letter after letter full of advice and suggestions, most of which Elizabeth sensibly ignored. There is one more thing about Elizabeth's letters, and it is worth raising because it is unresolved. They are relentlessly cheerful. She is always content, always well, always finding the bright side. Over 60 years of writing home to Devon. The novelist Kate Grenville, who edited a collection of them, has suggested they might be read as a wonderful piece of fiction, sustained over 60 years. A woman married to a man who shot his commanding officer, overthrew a government, and was eventually declared insane may not have been telling her family in England absolutely everything. And she did it through the worst years the colony had. There were droughts. There was the Great Flood on the Hawkesbury. There were shortages of labour, of food, of everything. There was the constant risk that a governor who disliked her husband would decide to make life difficult for his wife, which is precisely what a colonial governor could do. And while she was building the thing, a clergyman that both Macarthurs detested was in London, wearing a suit. Chapter 7. The King's Gift. The Reverend Samuel Marsden was the senior chaplain at Parramatta and a magistrate, and this film is not offering him to you as a hero. He had a contemporary reputation for savagery on the bench that has followed him for 2 centuries. He was also, from 1797, one of the first men in the colony to run sheep seriously for wool. He and John Macarthur loathed each other, and had done for years, over land, over stock, and over precedence. In 1807, the same year the Macarthurs sent their first bale, Marsden took about 165 pounds of colonial wool with him to England. The reception was extraordinary, for the same reason Macarthurs had been. The mills were desperate, and a clergyman from the far side of the world was carrying exactly what they could not get. Marsden had his wool woven into cloth in Yorkshire, had a suit made from it and wore that suit to an audience with King George III. The king was impressed enough to order clothes made for himself from Australian wool. And then he did something else, and this is the detail that undoes the entire Macarthur legend. He gave Marsden 5 merino sheep from the royal flock. Gave them, as a gift from the king, in recognition of what the man had brought him. John Macarthur had bought his royal flock sheep in 1804. Marsden was given his in 1809, and the proof of Marsden's case is not an argument. It is a physical object sitting in a museum in Sydney right now. The powerhouse holds wool samples from Marsden's sheep, dated 1804, which were sent to George III, rediscovered in a London office in 1886, and returned to Australia. Now the scholarship, because this is not one channel's opinion. The standard work is Garran and White's Merinos, Myths and Macarthurs, and its verdict on John Macarthur is blunt. He has gained, they write, a carefully fostered but unmerited reputation as a scientific breeder, a knowledgeable grazier, and a producer of superior sheep. None of these assumptions is tenable. His own entry in the Australian Dictionary of Biography describes his insistence on a colonial wool staple as a vision neither unique nor original, and credits him instead with skill as a publicist. The title, Father of the Australian Wool Industry, was pushed hardest in the 1920s and 30s, around the centenary of his death, by graziers associations and newspapers who wanted a founder. He was not the first. He was not the best breeder. He was the loudest, and he was in London when it counted. None of this means Macarthur did nothing. He made the Privy Council pay attention at exactly the moment Britain needed to hear it, and he came home with 5,000 acres and the beginnings of an industry. That is a real achievement, and it belongs to him. It is simply not the achievement written on the banknote, and every acre of it stood on ground taken from people who were still living on it. Chapter 8. Appin. By 1916, the Cow Pastures had been granted away. The frontier along the Hawkesbury and the Nepean was in open conflict, and there was drought. Aboriginal people were taking crops because the country they had fed themselves from for thousands of years was now under wheat and sheep, and because the yams and the game and the fishing places were gone or fenced. Settlers were retaliating. People were dying on both sides. On the 10th of April 1916, Governor Macquarie ordered 3 military detachments into the districts south and west of Sydney. Their written instructions were to capture Aboriginal people, and if they could not be captured, to shoot them. In the early hours of the 17th of April 1916, a detachment of the 46th Regiment under Captain James Wallace came upon a camp near the Cataract River at a place called Appin. At least 14 Dharawal men, women and children were killed. Some were shot where they lay. Others were driven over the gorge at Broughton Pass in the dark, in country they knew perfectly well and could not see. The memorial at Wollondilly puts it as plainly as it can be put. The actual number will never be known. Afterwards, the bodies of the dead men were hung in trees. Macquarie's own phrase for the purpose was to strike the greater terror into the survivors. There is a Macarthur connection in that same operation, and it should be stated exactly. The Dictionary of Sydney records that a party in the sweep was directed to the Macarthur estate at the Cow Pastures, where 2 men were killed and a boy was taken prisoner. Now the distinction this film has to draw, and draw carefully. Macquarie ordered Appin, not Macarthur. A governor of New South Wales signed those instructions, and the men who carried them out were British soldiers under a British officer. But the pastoral expansion that the Macarthurs led, lobbied for, and profited from was the engine that pushed the frontier out in the first place. The land grants created the pressure. The sheep created the value. The wealth in this story grew on that ground. Both of those things are true, and neither one cancels the other, and any version of this story that gives you only one of them is selling you something. It has been commemorated at Cataract Dam every year since 2000, and Dharawal descendants lead that commemoration. There is one more thing that should be said about the record here, because people assume this history is vague. It is not. The instructions survive. Wallace's own journal survives. The correspondence back to London survives. This is one of the best documented massacres on the Australian frontier, and the reason it is well documented is that the men who carried it out were following written orders and reporting back in writing afterwards. And the family that held that ground was about to run out of men. Chapter 9. The name dies. John Macarthur's last years were bad, and there is no dignity to be found in them. The paranoia and the mania that had made him such a formidable enemy for 30 years stopped being useful and started consuming him. He was estranged from Elizabeth at the end. In 1832, he was formally declared a lunatic and removed from the Legislative Council. He died at the home farm at Camden in April 1834. Elizabeth outlived him by 16 years. She died in 1850, aged 83, having watched the industry she had actually run become the largest export earner in the colony, and having never once been publicly credited with any of it. Now the arithmetic of the bloodline, because this is the real fall, and almost nobody tells it. 4 sons survived to adulthood, and between them they had a single child who lived to inherit. Edward had a long military career and left no legitimate heir. John Jr. died unmarried in London in 1831, aged 37, having just been appointed Chief Justice of New South Wales without ever taking up the post. James had exactly one child, a daughter, and in December 1882, Sir William Macarthur, the last surviving son, died childless. That was the end of it. The Macarthur name in this family went extinct in 1882, 91 years before the estate was sold. What happened next is the strangest fact in this entire story. James's daughter Elizabeth had married Captain Arthur Onslow in 1867 and she inherited. In 1892 she was granted a royal licence to take the surname Macarthur Onslow. The most famous surname in Australian agriculture had to be reattached by royal permission because the men had run out. And then the family that bred sheep started breeding soldiers. Major General George Macarthur Onslow commanded the 7th Light Horse at Gallipoli and later the 5th Light Horse Brigade in the advance on Damascus. He is also the man who organised the cricket match at Shell Green in December 1915, played under shell fire while the evacuation was being planned. Major General Sir Denzil Macarthur Onslow commanded the 6th Division Cavalry Regiment in Syria and then the 4th Armoured Brigade through New Guinea and Borneo from 1943 to 1946. And the paddocks themselves went to war. Macquarie Grove was a Macarthur Onslow sheep farm. In 1937, Edward Macarthur Onslow sold the flock off it and turned the horse track into an airstrip. When the war came, he offered the whole thing to the government, and in July 1940, the Commonwealth acquired 468 acres of it. It became RAAF Camden. The Central Flying School operated there from 1940, so did 32 Squadron. Late in the war, a Royal Air Force Transport Squadron flew Dakotas out of it. It is still an airport today, a sheep paddock cleared for aircraft 4 years before the war reached the Pacific, on land his great-grandfather had been granted for merinos. There is a symmetry in that which is hard to miss. The family had come to the cow pastures because it was the best grazing country anybody had seen. 130 years later, one of them looked at a paddock and saw a runway. 33 years later, the family sold almost everything else. Chapter 10. 170. The Macarthurs held Camden from the grant in 1805 until 1973, that is nearly 170 years, and the Australian sheep flock, at its peak, was roughly 170 million head. The same number. One of them is a family's tenure and the other is an industry summit, and both of them collapsed. Take the flock first, because it is the number that actually tells you what happened to this country's oldest industry. The peak came around 1970 or around 1990, depending on which statistical series you use, and this film is not going to pick one for the sake of a tidier sentence. Then came the reserve price scheme, which guaranteed growers a floor price and bought the wool nobody else wanted. The floor went up. The stockpile went up with it. On the 11th of February, 1991, the floor was abandoned. What was left in the sheds was somewhere between 4.5 and 4.7 million bales of wool, and a debt in the order of $2.5 billion, accruing storage and interest at a reported $3 million a day. In the cull that followed, an estimated 10.5 million sheep were killed. It took until about 2001 to sell the stockpile down. Where it sits now depends on who you ask, and the numbers genuinely differ. Meat and livestock. Australia put the national flock at about 74 million head in June 2025. Abares, using a different method, puts it lower. The forecasts run down toward the mid-60s of millions by 2028. Which would be the fewest sheep in this country since about 1904. And then the processing, where the popular claim needs correcting rather than repeating. You will hear that Australia no longer has a single wool processing plant. That is not quite true, and the truth is nearly as bad. After the Geelong scour closed in August 2025, there is essentially one early-stage processor left in the country and one full woolen mill at Launceston. In the 1990s, there were 26. Around 9/10 of the Australian clip now leaves this country greasy, unwashed and unprocessed, most of it bound for a single customer. The value that used to be added here is added somewhere else. Now, the cow pastures are the Macarthur growth corridor. Camden is among the fastest growing local government areas in New South Wales. The Appin precinct alone was rezoned in December 2023 for up to 12,900 homes, on the same ground where the 46th Regiment went out in 1816. Land named after the family that was granted it, being covered in houses. So here is the whole thing, flat. He did not bring the merinos here. He was not the first man to take colonial wool to London. He did not run the flock through the years that mattered because he was overseas for 12 of them and his wife did it. The name went extinct in 1882 and had to be restored by royal permission. The estate went in 1973. The industry is down by more than half and sends its wool overseas to be washed. And he is the one who ended up on the money. But there is a survival in this, and it has to be said, because it is true, and because it is the only warm thing left. Roughly 400 hectares around Camden Park House were never part of the 1973 sale. Direct descendants still own that land, still farm it, and still live in the house. 7 generations, unbroken, since 1805. It is one of the oldest homes in Australia, still occupied by the family that built it, and they open it to the public one weekend every September to pay for its upkeep. The $2 note was withdrawn in 1988 and replaced with a coin. It is still legal tender. It is worth exactly $2, and there is not a shop in the country that will take it. The man on it got the credit. The name itself did not survive him. And the woman who actually kept the sheep alive has never been on anything at all.